Hello everyone. Today we are going to expose the secret of how Pharaoh's servants outsmarted their masters. And you are not ready for how far this rabbit hole goes. Picture yourself under the searing Egyptian sun, dust clinging to your skin, the Nile shimmering in the distance like a vein of life. You're standing in the grand halls of a pharaoh's palace, where gold dazzles every corner, and yet, if you look closer, it is not the masters who hold the keys to survival, it's the servants. Their backs bent from labor, their eyes lowered in obedience. But behind those gestures of submission hides a sharper intelligence, the kind that kept them alive while dynasties rose and crumbled. You might think the pharaohs ruled with absolute power, but the truth? You probably wouldn't survive a single day here, not without knowing the tricks those servants carried like invisible weapons. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and your local time. I want to see just how far these hidden histories travel across the world. Now let's embark on today's secret history journey together. The marble floors are polished smooth, reflecting the sandals of priests and nobles, but you can almost hear the shuffle of the unseen, the workers who carried messages, poured wine, fetched jars of water from the riverbanks. To the pharaoh, they were little more than shadows. Yet these shadows noticed everything, the tremble in a general's hand as he bowed, the way a priest hesitated before reciting the words of the gods, the whispers of discontent that echoed louder than the beating drums. And those servants used what they saw. Outsmarting their masters did not mean leading revolts with swords or burning temples. It meant bending the smallest details of life until power slipped, unnoticed, into their calloused hands. Imagine yourself reaching for a goblet, the liquid cool against your lips, unaware that the servant who filled it has already tipped the balance of the night. Maybe he shifted the order of dishes so the pharaoh's favorite fish spoiled in the heat. Maybe he delivered a scroll a few hours late, forcing a general to miss his window of command. Small acts, invisible to the eyes of authority, but devastating in their ripple effects. Historians still debate whether Egypt's grand courts fell from the weight of their own grandeur, or from the invisible sabotage of those who lived beneath them. And here's the unsettling part: you begin to realize that this story is not just ancient. When you lean closer, you see the same strategies replayed across history. Servants in medieval castles feigned ignorance to overhear confessions. Ottoman harem attendants steered the affections of sultans. And even in the grand mansions of the Americas, enslaved people disguised cunning as obedience, turning survival into resistance. The pattern repeats, the powerless outthinking the powerful, often without leaving a single written trace, except in the subtle ways history bent its course. But for now, keep your eyes on the palace before you. The pharaoh's mask of godlike authority cracks in the heat, and you are standing at the crossroads of truth and illusion. Look past the columns, past the hieroglyphs carved in triumph. Focus on the silent figure carrying water jars through the shadows. To you, they may look invisible. To history, they are the hidden architects of survival. And in their quiet defiance, you are about to witness the most dangerous truth of all, that power is never as absolute as it pretends to be. The secret of how Pharaoh's servants outsmarted their masters often began with something as ordinary as water, yet in Egypt water was everything: life, power, and currency disguised in a clay jar. You watch as a barefoot servant walks steadily across the palace courtyard, balancing two jars that seem insignificant compared to the towering statues of Horus and Ra. But in this world, whoever controlled the flow of water held the pulse of survival. The Nile flooded and receded in cycles that dictated whether fields bloomed or starved. And in those long corridors of power, servants became gatekeepers of refreshment, purification, and ritual. Pharaohs demanded their baths to be drawn at precise hours. Priests required sacred water to cleanse before ceremonies, and nobles drank wine diluted with river water to ease the scorching heat. The one holding the jar unnoticed in the shadows, could tilt the balance between comfort and suffering with a single choice. Now you imagine yourself watching this game unfold. A jar filled from the cleaner tributary might restore a weary official's strength, while one drawn hastily from a muddied bank could spark days of illness. The masters rarely suspected sabotage, because why would a pharaoh or high priest believe a servant dared to meddle with the sacred order? That was the genius. The trick worked because arrogance blinded the powerful. You can almost hear the smirk beneath the servant's bowed head as he pours, his voice steady with ritual words, knowing he has shifted the odds in his favor. Historians still debate whether entire outbreaks of palace illness were truly natural, or whether they were carefully orchestrated by hands carrying jars too heavy for gold-covered fingers to ever lift. It wasn't just about poisoning or corruption, it was leverage. If a servant knew which source of water stayed pure longest, he could delay fetching it, making the pharaoh wait in frustration. A moment's hesitation before delivering the jar at a feast could spark suspicion between rivals. You realize how such tiny acts created ripple effects that reshaped alliances and carved unseen cracks into royal power. The secret of outsmarting lay in controlling the mundane, turning necessity into silent rebellion. Step deeper into the scene. A great banquet unfolds under painted ceilings, musicians playing lutes while nobles gorge on roasted fowl and honey cakes. Amid the noise, one servant moves slowly, deliberately placing jars along the tables. Most guests hardly notice, except the few who know the hidden game. To them, receiving water first meant favor, delay meant insult. Suddenly you see it, how a man in rags, invisible in the grand scheme, could ignite rivalry simply by where he placed his jar. The pharaoh might think he commanded loyalty with whips and decrees, but in reality, he sat at a table of illusions, each servant's step subtly shifting the balance of loyalty and betrayal. Strangest detail is how these servants often whispered prayers into the jars before delivering them, believing spirits of the river might carry their intentions. Some jars carried hope for protection, others curses muttered under breath. When the liquid touched the lips of masters, it wasn't only water, it was power, both material and mystical. And because superstition saturated the pharaoh's court, rumors of cursed jars spread quickly. You can almost feel the chill that ran down a general's spine when he drank and later stumbled, unsure if it was spoiled water or divine punishment. This practice traveled across cultures. In medieval Europe, water bearers manipulated who received clean or foul drinks during sieges. In the Ottoman court, palace attendants diluted sherbets in ways that shifted favor. Even in colonial mansions, enslaved house servants sometimes exploited knowledge of wells and cisterns to influence the moods of their masters. The echo of Egypt's water jar trick rippled forward, proof that the smallest tool could unmask the largest arrogance. So as you stand there, watching that single figure pour water into golden cups, remember, the grand walls of temples may still stand, but it was the unseen hands with jars who decided who thrived, who suffered, and who carried whispers of survival into the next dynasty. And that is how Pharaoh's servants outsmarted their masters by turning something as humble as a water jar into a throne of hidden control. The secret of how Pharaoh's servants outsmarted their masters was never written on papyrus, never carved into stone, because the game thrived in silence and shadows. You follow a narrow corridor behind the pharaoh's throne room, the walls damp from the Nile's breath, and here you begin to see how shadow games were played. Servants knew that words could kill faster than swords, and so they invented a language of glances, gestures, and coded marks hidden in plain sight. While the pharaoh believed himself the eye of Era, seeing all, his vision never reached into the dark corners where truth lived. You feel the tension as two servants pass one another, heads bowed low, yet a single brush of a finger across the forearm carries an entire message. Danger, delay, diversion. No decree could stop such signals because no one in power believed they existed. Imagine yourself sitting at the edge of a torch-lit chamber as scribes unfurl scrolls and priests chant. You notice how one servant places a tray not directly in front of a noble, but slightly to the left. A small adjustment that signals to another across the room. Maybe it means a guard is drunk. Maybe it means a corridor is clear. Maybe it means tonight is the night to hide a piece of grain or whisper a warning to a rival. Historians still debate whether entire palace intrigues were sparked by these signals, and whether dynasties fell not from invading armies, but from messages carried invisibly by the lowest ranks of society. This was more than survival, it was strategy. Servants understood the fragility of pride. A misplaced word could topple a minister, so they fed that fragility with carefully timed errors. A dish delivered too early or too late created suspicion. A candle snuffed before a ritual shifted meaning. These shadow games allowed them to manipulate outcomes without ever lifting a weapon. Pharaohs and generals believed they commanded with divine authority, but each decision was already nudged by the invisible hands of those they ignored. Strange details make the picture clearer. In some accounts, palace attendants smeared faint marks of ash or colored powder onto doorframes, a code so subtle it looked like ordinary dust. To the untrained eye, nothing unusual. But to servants, it was a map who could be trusted, which chamber to avoid, which rival might be plotting. You sense how brilliant this was. An empire built on order undone by patterns invisible to those who believed themselves too grand to notice. Dust, these games weren't confined to Egypt. In medieval monasteries, cooks tapped spoons against pots in sequences that carried hidden warnings. In the Ottoman palace, eunuchs developed hand signals to guide sultans' decisions without speaking. In the mansions of the Caribbean, enslaved workers braided hair with patterns that served as escape maps. The echo is haunting. Across continents and centuries, the powerless outsmarted the powerful by playing games hidden in the ordinary. Step closer into the Pharaoh's hall again. You see him draped in linen and jewels, convinced the court bends entirely to his will. Yet behind him, a servant adjusts a torch, and in that flicker of flame lies the signal that tonight a general will be delayed, that tomorrow a shipment will be late, that next week the court will whisper of betrayal. None of this will be written, but all of it will shape the future. You realize the unsettling truth that history is not only carved by kings but by invisible hands moving in silence. So when you hear the phrase, the secret of how Pharaoh's servants outsmarted their masters, understand it was not rebellion in the open. It was rebellion disguised as loyalty, obedience masking strategy, silence carrying the weight of power. And the most dangerous game of all was the one no master could see, because arrogance blinded them to the dust on their own floor. The secret of how Pharaoh's servants outsmarted their masters sometimes looked like obedience, but tasted like quiet rebellion. And nowhere was this clearer than at the feasts. Picture yourself entering a banquet hall where torches flicker against painted walls, the air thick with roasted goose, honey cakes, and spiced wine. Golden cups clink, nobles laugh too loudly, and the pharaoh presides like a living god. But if you shift your gaze downward, you notice the silent army moving between tables. Servants carrying trays, pouring drinks, sweeping crumbs. Their heads are bowed, their lips sealed, yet beneath this show of loyalty lies a theater of cunning. You probably wouldn't survive long here without learning how every glance, every step, every piece of food could become a weapon in disguise. Watch closely. A servant slices bread with deliberate slowness, then places it first before a minor noble instead of a general. The shift is so slight it seems meaningless, but suddenly suspicion sparks between rivals. Another servant pours wine, tilting the jug so one man's cup brims while another's stays half empty. That imbalance is noticed, and whispers begin to coil like snakes. This is the brilliance. You realize the feast is not about the food, but about the flow of subtle insults and favors, orchestrated by the invisible hands in linen tunics. Historians still debate whether these small manipulations pushed alliances into collapse, whether dynasties cracked because of rivalries born not in the battlefield but at golden tables. Now imagine yourself seated at that table. You lift a cup only to find the liquid oddly bitter. Did the servant mix the wrong jar of water, or was this deliberate? Across the hall, a rival smirks, his cup overflowing with sweetened wine. You feel the sting of insult, and the game has already worked its poison. The masters believed they were dining on loyalty, but in truth, they were swallowing theater carefully staged by those they ignored. The strangest details hide in the margins. Servants smuggled messages by carving tiny notches in loaves, signals only their peers could read. A slice offered with the crust turned outward might mean, beware, while one turned inward meant safe. Others folded scraps of cloth under dishes, coded warnings disguised as ordinary napkins. You can almost see the Pharaoh feasting in grandeur while right beneath his nose, rebellion whispered in breadcrumbs and crumbs of cloth. This trick was not unique to Egypt. In medieval Europe, kitchen workers salted dishes heavily for enemies, while serving delicacies perfectly cooked to allies. In the Ottoman palaces, harem attendants used dessert trays to deliver coded symbols to favored concubines. Even in 19th century plantations, enslaved cooks used spice blends and meal timing to control their masters' moods. The echo is chilling food has always been both sustenance and weapon, and those who prepared it quietly shaped the fate of the powerful. Step back into the banquet once more. The Pharaoh raises his goblet, declaring eternal glory, but you notice his eyes narrowing as he catches a noble shifting uneasily, insulted by how his plate arrived late. The servants pretend not to notice, yet you see their smirks hidden in bowed heads. They have shifted the energy of the room with nothing more than bread and wine. And that is the truth you can't unsee. Obedience on the surface, control in the shadows. So when you hear the phrase, the secret of how Pharaoh's servants outsmarted their masters, remember this feast. Remember that under the glittering glow of gold, it was not the Pharaoh's decree that shaped the night, but the unseen choreography of those who carried trays. And the greatest rebellion of all was that no one at the table realized they were already dancing to the servants' silent rhythm. The secret of how Pharaoh's servants outsmarted their masters often revealed itself in moments of weakness, when the powerless discovered that pretending to be fragile could be more dangerous than showing strength. Picture yourself in the heart of the palace, the air thick with incense, guards stationed stiffly by columns carved with divine symbols. A servant stumbles forward, coughing into his sleeve, his shoulders slumped as though the weight of the gods pressed against his chest. The Pharaoh glances at him with irritation, but does not order punishment. What if this man carries sickness, a curse that could spread like fire through the court? In a world where plague and pestilence were believed to be punishments from the gods, even the most arrogant ruler hesitated. That hesitation was power. You can feel it, the tension between appearance and reality. A servant who feigned illness could buy days of rest, avoid dangerous tasks, or force masters to seek alternatives. Sometimes it was genuine, but often it was a mask, a calculated act of survival. Historians still debate whether waves of sudden sickness among attendants were coincidences or coordinated acts of resistance. Imagine an entire group coughing at once, limping together, creating fear so sharp that even generals paused their commands. The Pharaoh's servants learned that frailty, real or staged, could become a shield sharper than bronze. Step closer. You notice another layer of cunning, illness as disguise for sabotage. A servant appearing too weak to carry heavy jars might actually be slipping forbidden messages hidden in the folds of bandages. One who staggered with a feverish look might be planting seeds of rumor, whispering that the gods were displeased. The masters rarely questioned it because fear of disease made them superstitious. That was the brilliance the trick worked because it fed into the very fears of those in power. Unusual details surface in scattered records. Some accounts describe servants rubbing ash on their skin to mimic sores, or chewing bitter herbs to make their breath foul, convincing their masters they were contagious. You can almost smell the acrid bitterness, see the alarmed faces of nobles stepping back, unwilling to risk the wrath of unseen spirits. In those moments, the servant controlled distance, movement, and opportunity. To feign weakness was to dictate the rhythm of the palace. The echo of this strategy stretches far beyond Egypt. In medieval Europe, peasants pretended injury to avoid conscription into wars. In Ottoman harems, attendants feigned fainting spells to overhear secret conversations as concerned nobles leaned close. In colonial plantations, enslaved people often simulated exhaustion or collapse, forcing overseers to slow the pace of labor. Across cultures and centuries, the powerless bent weakness into strength, showing how fragility itself could become an invisible rebellion. Now return your eyes to the Pharaoh's court. You see the ruler reclining on a gilded chair, confident in divine power, yet hesitating when one coughing servant kneels before him. Guards look uneasy, priests whisper prayers, and the air thickens with doubt. The Pharaoh may have commanded armies and monuments, but in that instant, his authority shrank before the fear of a hidden illness. And you realize with a jolt of curiosity that this was not coincidence. It was strategy carved into silence. So when you think of the secret of how Pharaoh's servants outsmarted their masters, remember this cloak of illness. Remember that survival did not always come from strength or rebellion in the open. Sometimes it came from a cough, a stumble, a smear of ash across the skin. And in those subtle performances, the powerless forced the powerful to pause, reshaping decisions that would ripple far beyond the palace walls. The secret of how Pharaoh's servants outsmarted their masters did not vanish with the fall of Egypt's dynasties. It traveled across centuries, morphing into the hidden strategies of the powerless in castles, harems, and plantations. You drift through time as though pulled by invisible threads, stepping from the shadow of the pyramids into the stone corridors of a medieval fortress. Torches flicker against damp walls, knights stomp in clattering armor, and yet, once again, you notice the quiet figures moving in silence. The servants sweep floors, pour ale, tend fires, and they are invisible until you realize they are listening, memorizing every careless boast. In those whispered secrets, they hold more power than the armored men who ignore them. You picture yourself crouched in a corner of the great hall, watching a servant refill a goblet while pretending not to hear a barren grumble about rebellion. That single overheard sentence, carried later to the right ear, could determine the fate of an entire estate. Historians still debate whether the betrayals that shattered kingdoms were born from ambition at the top or from whispers passed upward by those at the bottom. The pattern is haunting. Servants who seemed powerless guiding the rhythm of history without ever drawing a sword. Step forward again, into the Ottoman palaces of Istanbul, where eunuchs glided silently through gilded corridors. Their role was to guard and serve, yet they learned to steer the desires of sultans and viziers with carefully chosen words. A nod here, a subtle suggestion there, and entire wars shifted course. To the masters, it looked like loyalty. To you, watching from the shadows, it is clear. The legacy of Pharaoh's servants lived on, disguised as obedience. Strange details emerge when you look closely. In some accounts, harem attendants embroidered clothing with tiny patterns meant as signals, delicate stitches that carried hidden meaning for those who knew how to read them. The garments dazzled with color, but beneath the silk threads lay codes that could alter the balance of affection and influence. You imagine how a single robe might decide which concubine gained favor, and in turn, who shaped the destiny of empires. The echoes of Egypt's silent rebellions ripple across centuries, stitched into cloth, poured into goblets, hidden in the spaces between words. Cross the ocean, and you find yourself in a colonial mansion. The masters sit on wide verandas sipping imported tea, convinced of their control, while enslaved servants move like shadows across the floorboards. And yet here too the strategies resurface. Meals are delayed, tools misplaced. Small accidents pile up until the household feels the weight of quiet resistance. Some even braided maps into their hair, patterns guiding escape routes under the guise of simple style. To the arrogant, it looked like obedience. To the desperate, it was the blueprint of freedom. Now step back and notice the common thread weaving through these places. Whether in pyramids, castles, palaces, or plantations, the powerless mastered the same art, turning invisibility into a weapon. They bent the ordinary until it became extraordinary. They exploited arrogance until it cracked, and they wrapped their rebellion in silence until history mistook it for loyalty. You cannot help but feel awe at the persistence of these patterns, echoing through time like a secret rhythm no empire could silence. So when you reflect on the secret of how Pharaoh's servants outsmarted their masters, remember that it was never only about Egypt. It was a seed planted in the sands, carried forward by centuries of the unseen. And it reminds you that power is always more fragile than it looks, because the hands that carry trays, sweep floors, and pour water are the same hands that quietly guide the fate of empires.
The secret of how Pharaoh's servants outsmarted their masters reaches its sharpest edge when you realize it wasn't only about survival, it was about revenge disguised as loyalty. Picture yourself standing in the throne room as dawn breaks, golden light streaming across pillars carved with gods and victories. The Pharaoh sits high upon his gilded seat, cloaked in authority, certain that no shadow can touch him. Yet behind him, a servant approaches with calm steps, eyes lowered, hands folded in obedience. You lean closer and see it, the faintest curl of a smile, the kind that hides a secret joke only the powerless understand. At that moment, you sense the palace is not ruled by the man on the throne, but by those who know exactly how to chip away at his certainty without ever raising a sword. The hook sinks deeper when you notice how laughter worked as rebellion. Servants who appeared silent by day gathered by night, mocking their masters in whispers and gestures. A crooked walk imitating a noble, a muttered prayer twisted into sarcasm, and suddenly the illusion of divine authority cracked. Historians still debate whether these small acts of ridicule weakened the very aura of pharaohs, turning awe into quiet doubt. Imagine the power of laughter echoing in dark corridors, laughter no decree could silence. That was the last laugh of the forgotten, sharper than any blade. Step into another scene, a banquet where nobles gorge themselves under painted ceilings. You notice a servant dropping a spoon, a tiny clatter lost in the noise, but his glance sparks chuckles among his peers. It is a private rebellion, invisible to the powerful but electric to those who serve. You feel it, the thrill of knowing the masters sit blind at their own table, oblivious to the jokes woven into every gesture. It is here, in humor hidden under humility, that the powerless truly claimed victory. Unusual details breathe life into this truth. Some records suggest servants carved crude cartoons of their masters on scraps of pottery, buried them in sand as offerings to forgotten gods of irony. Others mimicked the pharaoh's elaborate rituals with exaggerated movements when alone, mocking the very gestures that bound Egypt together. You picture it vividly. Golden crowns parodied with reed baskets, grand decrees imitated with nonsense chants, and in those moments, authority dissolved into comedy. The secret of outsmarting lay not only in sabotage, but in stripping fear from power. This final trick echoes across ages. In medieval courts, jesters ridiculed kings under the guise of entertainment, planting seeds of doubt in every laugh. In Ottoman palaces, attendants turned gossip into sly humor that shifted alliances. In colonial plantations, enslaved workers sang mocking songs in coded rhythms, rebellion hidden in melody. Each echo proves the same point. When you laugh at power, you rob it of its sacred mask. Now you return to the Pharaoh's hall one last time. The ruler's eyes burn with certainty, but as you look closer, you see cracks invisible to him, cracks carved not by armies, but by servants who dared to turn obedience into irony. And you realize the twist. The empire may have written monuments to pharaohs, but the living pulse of history belongs to those who laughed in the shadows. So the secret of how Pharaoh's servants outsmarted their masters ends not with revolt in flames, but with a quieter fire, one that burned in smiles, whispers, and mocking gestures. The true architects of survival and defiance were never seated on thrones. They were kneeling beside them, carrying trays, sweeping floors, and quietly rewriting the rules. And the lesson for you is unsettling yet liberating. Sometimes the mightiest power is undone not by war, but by laughter, cunning, and the courage to turn obedience into a mask for rebellion. Now slow down, breathe deep, and let the echoes of this story soften. Imagine the torches of the Pharaoh's palace fading into candlelight, the noise of banquets and whispers dissolving into silence. You are no longer standing in the heat of Egypt, or drifting through castles and palaces. You are resting, safe and calm, your heartbeat slowing as though history itself exhales. The laughter of servants, once sharp and defiant, now blurs into a hum, like distant waves against the shore. You let the images fade, and what remains is the quiet knowledge that even in the darkest times, resilience hides in ordinary gestures, and hope is stronger than fear. Carry that with you tonight, and may it bring peace to your mind as you close your eyes. End of script. Wishing you much joy and health.